Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at Riverside Church here for our online service. We do love being able to connect to the wider community through these little broadcasts and hope that they're helpful to you and that you enjoy them. We're about to start our 11 o'clock service where Sarah will be preaching and bringing a few thoughts from John chapter 21. Another piece of exciting news is that we shall be announcing today to the church that we're starting a second morning service, which will be at 9:15. And so if you're ever in the area and able to join us for either our 9:15, which will start in June, or our 11 o'clock, which is ongoing now, you'd be so welcome. Thank you again for being here, and we hope this morning is a real blessing to you. Bye for now.
The reading is from John 21, verses 1 to 19. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net out on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with some fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, he took the bread and he gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Thanks, Jen. I love those verses. These verses have got to be right on up there with some of my top favourite passages that Helen has ever asked me to speak on. I love this chapter a whole lot. So I just want to jump straight on into this with you this morning. I'm not messing about with you today. You'll be relieved to hear, which kind of implies that all I usually do is mess about with you when I speak to you. It's too late now, I've gone and said it.
Never mind. Well, a couple of weeks back, Steve walked us very brilliantly, as he always does, of course, through John chapter 20. And actually, in the closing verses of that chapter, we get this very clear sense that the author and the apostle John had every intention of finishing his book off at that point, at the end of chapter 20. Take a look. These are the last few verses. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you may have life in his name. Amen to that. Full stop, the end. And what a great finish, by the way, John. I love that. He proper socked the gospel at them in that last sentence, didn't he? Very good. What a great finish to a book. And then it's almost as if he was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa. Wait a minute. Hang on. I've changed my mind. I've got to kind of say this one more story to you. I can't leave this bit out. I've just got to tell you this bit as well. And this one final story that John's decided that he's just got to include here mainly just focuses in on one disciple by the name of Peter. And Jesus, sometimes we see Jesus switch back to calling him by his full name, Simon, son of John, which kind of feels a little bit like he's telling him off, doesn't it, when he uses his full name? I'm not sure he was, but it kind of feels a little bit that way. So Peter was one of Jesus's first disciples. He was one of his closest disciples. And it's probably also pretty fair to say that he was one of his more impulsive disciples. Whatever came into his head seemed to come straight on out of his mouth. When he rarely thought anything through, he was reactive. He'd make off-the-wall decisions and try to figure out the consequences of those decisions after it was too late to do anything about it. That was Peter. And I love that about him because we see some of Peter's greatest standout moments just because that was who he was. In Matthew chapter 14, when Peter literally walks on the water towards Jesus. We see it in Matthew chapter 16, when Peter boldly declares, when Jesus asks his disciples, who do you think I am? Peter boldly declares that you are Jesus the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. And we see another of those standout moments in Matthew chapter 26, when Peter confidently announces that even if everyone else disowns Jesus, even if everyone else decides to abandon him, even if everyone else falls away from him, Peter declares that he would rather die alongside Jesus than ever do any of that stuff. And on that very same night, we see that very same Peter, who only hours earlier declared that he would never, ever disown Jesus, doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do. Not once, not twice, but 3 times over. Peter watches from a distance as Jesus is arrested, mocked, scorned, beaten, and tortured. And as Peter sits around a burning fire trying to keep warm, remember I said that because I'm coming back to that bit. As Peter sits around a burning fire trying to keep warm, the questions start coming out of nowhere. Come on, clicker, go for it. All right, Joe, it's all yours. It's not behaving as per usual. There we go. One of the serving maids sitting around the fire noticed him, then took a second look and said, "This man was with him." He denied it. "Woman, I don't even know him." A short time later, someone else noticed him and said, You're one of them." But Peter denied it. "Man, I am not." About an hour later, someone else spoke up, really adamant. "He's got to have been with him. He's got Galilean written all over him." Peter said, "Man, I don't even know what you are talking about." At that very moment, the last word hardly off his lips, a rooster crowed. Just then the master turned and looked at Peter. Peter remembered what the master had said to him. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." He went out and he cried and cried and cried. So we need to understand that the Peter that we meet when we arrive at today's passage was a broken man. He'd boldly declared that he would give Jesus everything. He'd stood there in front of everyone, in front of all of those disciples, and proclaimed that he would always and forever be going all out after Jesus. He'd looked his closest friend right in the face and told him that he'd always be there, that he'd never let him down. And in that moment around the fire, Jesus looked right back into the face of Peter. And that one look was enough to break him. He knows. Peter must have thought. He knows. Jesus knows. He knows I've let him down. He knows I've betrayed him. He heard me. He's seen me. How could I ever have thought, even for a second, that I could have been more for him, that I could have gone further? In that one moment when he most needed me to stand up and to stand out for him, I gave him nothing. I gave him nothing. What in the world must he think of me now? No one else could possibly gone and have hurt him the way that I've just gone and hurt him. Even if I could see him again, why in the world would he ever want to see me? There's just no way that he's ever going to want to do that. You know what? I really do think that Jesus knew that Peter would be feeling that way. I think that Jesus knew the way that Peter was feeling and thinking so well that pretty much straight after his resurrection, Jesus starts sending Peter these extra little messages just to single him out. Let me show you what I mean. Thanks, Joe. In Mark chapter 16, verse 7, at the empty tomb, Jesus has just risen. And some of the women receive these instructions. They're told to go to tell his disciples. And here we go, to tell his disciples and Peter. And Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Do you think that Peter would have turned up at the Sea of Galilee that day had he not first heard that message? If the message was just, go and tell his disciples, would Peter have been on the beach that day if he'd only heard that bit? You know what? I don't think he would have done. Because I don't think that Peter classed himself as one of Jesus's disciples anymore. I've always loved that the words "and Peter" are added here. I love that every time we start to question our identity, every time we start to question our worth or our value, every time we start to question, just as Peter must have been questioning whether we still even come into the category of a disciple of Jesus. I love that every time we do that, Jesus purposefully singles us out. He singles us out. I love that he singled Peter out too, because if Peter was anything like me, he would have spent that week silently beating himself up. He would have spent that week overanalyzing and overthinking every moment of those last few days, to the point where he no longer would have believed that he belonged at all. Jesus knew that. And I've just got this hunch that this 2-word invitation, and Peter, was all the nudge that Peter needed to get him moving back towards Jesus again. Thanks, Jay. You know, none of the other Gospels that we read here in chapter 21 tell this story. Only John tells it. And it's only because John tells it that we get to know that Peter's denial wasn't the end of the story for him. Jesus was about to do this whole incredible work of restoration in Peter's life, and he didn't even know it yet. And as I've pulled this passage apart over the last week or so, I've noticed that the way that Jesus goes about restoring Peter is by very deliberately and very intentionally recreating some of those key moments in Peter's walk with Jesus. So here we go. Number 1, he recreates Peter's moment of connection with Jesus. Verses 3-6. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, okay, or we'll go with you. So they went out, they got into a boat, and that night they caught nothing. Surprise, surprise. Can't do anything well if we try to do it without Jesus, can we? Verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you caught any fish? And by the way, just as an aside, Jesus is absolutely messing about with them here, because the Greek translation of that word friends is actually more literally translated as little children or infants. So it actually kind of reads like, God, little children, what are you like? You're not caught any fish? He's kind of laughing at them, and it would have got their attention, but probably not in a very good way. Don't ever let anybody tell you that God's not got a sense of humour, because he really has. He was laughing at them. Haven't you caught any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your nets in on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And if you're thinking that this story sounds pretty familiar to you, then that's probably because you have already heard a very, very similar story at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Luke chapter 5, verses 1-11. You know that story where the disciples have been working all night and they catch nothing. And then Jesus appears and he says, well, throw your nets back in for a catch. And they catch such a large number of fish, don't they, that the nets begin to break. You know that story? And in that story, Peter falls to his knees and he says, you need to stay away from me, Jesus, because all I seem to do is mess up. I'm not someone you need to be around. And Jesus says back to him, there's no way I'm doing that, Peter. You're mine now. You belong to me. and I've got this whole new life planned out for you. I'm paraphrasing that big time, by the way. You can read the proper story in Luke chapter 5. But we know that story, right? We know how that story goes. And please, please don't miss this. Don't miss that at the very point of Peter's greatest failure, Jesus recreates the very moment where Peter was first called to walk alongside Jesus. At that very point where Peter has never been more aware of his own inadequacy, Jesus triggers that memory of how it all began for Peter. And in effect, he's saying to him, Peter, we're still okay, you and me. I still love you, Peter. My grace is still sufficient for you. You still belong to me. I still want you walking with me. Come on, Peter. Don't you remember how it all began? Nothing's changed. Come walk with me again. And as soon as Peter figures out that it's Jesus, he then responds without thinking all over again, because it's Peter, right? So he responds without thinking. I've never heard, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of people putting more clothes on to get into the water. Have you? I've never heard of that, but that's exactly what Peter does. That's exactly what Peter does. We had to do it once for one of our swimming lessons when we were kids, but only because our swimming teacher was trying to prove the point that it is ridiculously hard to get anywhere quickly with your clothes on if you're trying to swim. You don't get anywhere very quickly, and the disciples were only about 100 yards out from the shore. So whenever I read verses 7 and 8, I get this whole image and this picture in my head of Peter trying to make this painfully slow progress towards the shoreline. And the disciples are kind of like right there next to him, in the boat next to him, going like, rowing alongside him, kind of going, what are you doing, Peter? There's a perfectly good boat right here. You could just get into the boat, mate. You get to Jesus faster that way if you just get into the boat. And then they're like, well, no, he's in the zone, lads. Come on, let's just cheer him on. He's in the zone. We'll just let him do it. Come on, Peter, you can do it, mate. You're doing really well. He looks crazy. He looks ridiculous. And you kind of get that image in my mind when I read that. But my point is that moving yourself back into closer proximity to Jesus doesn't have to look pretty. It doesn't have to look elegant. All you have to do is come to him just as you are, with all of your fears, with all of your failings, with all of your baggage. And clearly, Peter had plenty of that, dragging all of those clothes through the water with him. Come to him just as you are. It doesn't have to be a 10 out of 10 swan dive. Just throw yourself in and come. Number 2, thanks, Joe. Jesus recreates the moment of Peter's failure. You know, it just can't be a coincidence that Jesus' conversation with Peter starts around that charcoal fire. Verse 9, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with some fish on it and some bread. And funnily enough, if we backtrack a couple of chapters, thanks Joe, to Peter's denial, John chapter 18, verse 18 says something pretty similar. It says it was cold and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. And we can't miss this little point either, because Peter denied Jesus those 3 times as he warmed himself around a fire. And now again, because he'd decided it was a good idea to take that swimming lesson, because he's dripping wet and more than likely just a little bit cold, he's got no choice but to sit with Jesus and warm himself around a fire. Now, I don't know if that triggered the memory of it all for Peter, but it most definitely would have done that for me. And I believe that Jesus very intentionally planned it that way. He triggers that moment with the fire and says, "Come on, Peter, it's time. We need to talk this through. We need to deal with this." So skipping to verse 15, when they had finished eating, there we go. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And you know what? If Jesus had any intention of shaming Peter that day, he would have pointed him backwards. He would have picked apart every moment of Peter's denial and zoned right in on that. But he doesn't. He doesn't do that. Jesus points Peter forwards. He commissions Peter into action all over again. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep, Peter. Jesus very deliberately asks Peter the same question 3 times over. Do you love me? He recreates the moment where Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus does that on purpose, but I don't believe that he does it to hurt Peter. I believe that he does it to heal him. Not to hurt him, but to heal him. If Jesus didn't recreate that moment of Peter's greatest failure, then every time he sat by some charcoal fire, every time he heard a rooster crow, every time he was around those other disciples who'd heard him say that he would give Jesus everything, every time he was around that, it would have taken him back all over again to that moment where he failed Jesus. Those negative voices would have started out in his thinking all over again. Peter would have carried that constant weight of anxiety and shame and guilt on his shoulders, and he never would have moved on from that. It would have dominated his thinking and clouded any future plans that God had for him. But Jesus brings Peter right back to this moment of failure, just so that he can move him on from it. And he'll do that very same thing with you. He'll draw you right back into connection with him. He'll tell you all over again that he loves you, that he's for you, that you're still his, that you belong to him. He'll tell you all of that. And then he'll say, "But now we have to deal with this. My precious son, my precious daughter. Now we've got to deal with this. You can't stay here. This isn't your end point. This isn't game over for you. I've got more for you, but you've got to let me deal with this first." And he'll very deliberately take you back to the greatest moment of failure in your life, just so that he can bring about your greatest healing. Number 3, can I ask the band to come back up, please? Because this is the shortest point in the history of the points that I've ever made. Thank you. Number 3, Jesus creates the moment of Peter's calling. When Peter first meets Jesus, Jesus says to him, Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, "Come, follow me." And Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. And here again, in verses 18 and 19, Jesus echoes back to Peter that very same calling, except he adds in this extra little caveat. He says, very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, after he's just dropped that nice little bombshell, then he said to him, follow me. Follow me. If you are ready to follow Jesus again this morning, why don't you stand with me? If it's the first time you've made that decision to follow Jesus this morning, there's no better time than right now to stand. If it is the 275th time that you've stood and said, yes, Jesus, I'm going all out after you, you can stand with me too. Follow me. Not just for Peter, but for us too. Following Jesus is always going to come with a cost. But here Jesus says to Peter, and he says to us too, will you follow me anyway? Even knowing that you'll have to make sacrifices for me, even though you know where you're weak, will you go again anyway where I lead you? Will you lay aside your failures and instead be led by your faith? Will you believe that my grace is sufficient for you? Will you believe that I'm enough, even when you feel like you're not enough? Will you trust me, no matter what? Will you follow me? I don't know if there's anybody here today who's never made that choice for the first time to follow Jesus. But I'd like to stand here and tell you this morning that there is no better decision that you could ever make than to follow him, to give all of who you are over to him.
For my family, I speak the whole